He thought it would be just another day. Another black man he could harass without consequences. But what happens when the man he targets isn't just anyone, but an FBI agent? And when the tables turn, this so-called tough cop is about to face a reality he never saw coming. Stay tuned. The sun was just beginning to rise over Minneapolis, casting a soft golden glow over the quiet streets. Malcolm Bennett tightened the laces on his running shoes, inhaling the crisp morning air as he stepped outside. The neighborhood was still asleep, save for a few early risers walking their dogs or sipping coffee on their porches. Running had always been his way of clearing his mind before the long, demanding hours at the FBI office. It wasn't just about exercise, it was about maintaining balance, keeping his mind sharp. The rhythmic pounding of his feet against the pavement helped him focus, to block out the noise of the world and settle into a steady rhythm of thought. As he turned onto the main road leading to the park, he noticed the police cruiser parked a short distance away. At first, it was just another patrol car. Nothing unusual, but as he ran past, he felt it. The weight of someone's gaze locked onto him. He didn't stop, didn't slow down, but his instincts flared to life. Years of training had sharpened his awareness of even the smallest details. The officer inside the cruiser, a broad-shouldered man with a stiff posture, was watching him. Not a casual glance, not a passing curiosity, something deeper. Malcolm forced himself to keep running, his breath steady, his expression neutral. There was no reason to react. Not yet. The path through the park was lined with towering trees, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. This was his usual route, familiar and predictable, but today, something felt different. When he reached the far end of the trail, he looped around and ran back toward the entrance. The police cruiser was still there, the officer inside still watching. His mind raced through the possibilities. Was it a coincidence? Had there been an incident in the neighborhood? Or was this about him? He finished his run, keeping his pace even as he passed the cruiser again. This time, he glanced just long enough to catch the officer's name badge, Lawson. Back at his apartment complex, he let himself in, closing the door behind him and taking a moment to slow his breathing. He toweled off, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. He had dealt with law enforcement his entire career, had worked alongside good cops and bad ones. He knew the look Lawson had given him. It wasn't suspicion, it was something else. Stepping out onto his balcony, he scanned the street below. The cruiser was gone. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was overthinking it. Then he saw it. A bright orange slip tucked under his windshield wiper. A parking citation. He frowned. He had parked in his assigned spot, just as he always did. There was no reason for a violation. Taking the slip in his hand, he read the infraction. Improper parking. No permit displayed. Except he had a permit, clearly visible on his dashboard. His grip tightened around the paper. This wasn't just a ticket. This was a message. The morning air still carried the coolness of the early hours as Malcolm guided his car down the familiar route toward downtown. The streets were steadily coming to life. Commuters waiting at bus stops. Joggers finishing their morning runs. Storefronts flipping their signs from closed to open. It was the kind of routine that brought a sense of normalcy. But today, something felt different. Halfway through the drive, he caught a glimpse of flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. His stomach tightened as the police cruiser behind him signaled for him to pull over. He took a slow breath, keeping his expression neutral as he eased his car to the curb. He watched in the mirror as the officer stepped out. Derek Lawson. Lawson approached with a deliberate pace, one hand resting near his utility belt. When he reached the driver's side window, he leaned down slightly, his face unreadable except for a hint of something Malcolm recognized: control. "There's been a report about a suspicious vehicle matching yours," Lawson said, his voice steady but laced with an edge. "Mind stepping out of the car?" Malcolm kept both hands visible on the steering wheel. "What exactly makes my car suspicious, officer?" Lawson tilted his head, as if debating whether to engage or simply exert his authority. "We received a call," he said after a beat. "That's all I need." Malcolm knew the game being played. He'd seen it before, both in his line of work and in too many stories that ended in headlines. "I'd like to know the nature of the complaint," Malcolm said, his voice calm, measured. Lawson's mouth curved slightly, but it wasn't a smile. More like the amusement of someone who enjoyed watching others squirm. Step out of the vehicle. A moment passed, stretched taut. Then Malcolm exhaled and unbuckled his seatbelt, stepping onto the pavement with controlled movements. Lawson wasted no time. He circled the car, glancing through the windows before stopping at the trunk. Pop it. Malcolm hesitated. Do you have a warrant? Lawson's jaw tensed. I don't need one if I have probable cause. And what exactly is your probable cause? The officer stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled sharply through his nose. Do you always have this many questions? Or just when you're guilty of something? From across the street, a woman had stopped near a convenience store. Phone raised slightly. Malcolm saw her hesitate before she turned away, as if deciding against getting involved. Lucy Morales. He didn't know her name yet, but she would matter. Meanwhile, Lawson tapped the trunk with his knuckles. Last time I'm asking. Open it. Malcolm knew his rights, but he also knew pushing back too hard in the moment would only escalate things. He pressed the release button inside the car, and the trunk popped open. Lawson rummaged through it longer than necessary, moving things around as if searching for something that wasn't there. Eventually, he slammed it shut. You're clean, he said, though he sounded almost disappointed. Malcolm met his gaze. Of course I am. For a second, neither man moved. Then Lawson stepped closer, lowering his voice. I suggest you take a different route to work from now on. He said, you might not be this lucky next time. Malcolm held his ground, watching as Lawson returned to his cruiser. The officer lingered for a moment longer before driving off, the threat still hanging in the air. Across the street, Lucy Morales stood frozen, phone still clutched in her hand. Their eyes met briefly before she turned away. Slipping inside the store, Malcolm exhaled slowly. This wasn't over. Malcolm had always been aware of his surroundings. It was a habit ingrained in him through years of fieldwork, an instinct that rarely failed. But over the past few days, that awareness had turned into something sharper, unsettling. It wasn't just a gut feeling. There were patterns. The police cruiser with its dark-tinted windows, parked half a block from his apartment. The same vehicle trailing him when he turned onto the freeway. Never too close, but never far enough to be a coincidence. The quick glimpse of Lawson behind the wheel, sunglasses shielding his eyes even when the sky was overcast. Malcolm kept his routine as normal as possible. He still stopped by his regular coffee shop on his way to work. Still took the same roads. But every morning, the tension in his chest grew. One evening, as he stepped out of a grocery store, juggling a bag of produce and his keys, he noticed something odd. His car door handle looked off. Not damaged, but touched. The subtle disturbance in the dust on the handle. The faint smudge near the keyhole. It was the kind of detail most people wouldn't notice. But Malcolm did. He placed his bags on the hood, scanning the parking lot. There were no obvious threats. No lurking figures. Just the hum of streetlights and the distant murmur of traffic. His instincts whispered one thing. Someone had tried to get inside his car. Later that night, he made a call. Daniel Carter had been his friend for over a decade. A sharp-minded civil rights attorney. He had spent years battling cases of racial profiling, police misconduct, and corruption. If there was one person who understood what Malcolm was up against, it was Daniel. They met at a small bar on the east side of town. Daniel, always impeccably dressed, sat waiting with a glass of bourbon in hand. He waved Malcolm over, studying him as he took a seat. You look like a man with a problem, Daniel said, taking a slow sip. Malcolm set his phone on the table. It's more than a problem. Daniel listened as Malcolm laid it out. The ticket, the traffic stop, the constant presence of Lawson's cruiser, the attempted break-in. He didn't interrupt, just nodded occasionally, his fingers tapping lightly against the rim of his glass. When Malcolm finished, Daniel exhaled through his nose. That's not paranoia, he said. That's targeting. Malcolm leaned back in his chair. I figured as much. Daniel glanced around the bar before lowering his voice. If this guy has you in his sights, he won't stop at intimidation. These kinds of cops, they don't back off until someone makes them. Malcolm crossed his arms. Then let's make him. Daniel studied him for a moment, then pulled out his phone. I'll do some digging. His expression darkened as he scrolled through files. I think I've heard Lawson's name before. If he's got history, we'll find it. Malcolm nodded. And if he does? Daniel met his gaze. Then we make sure he's not just another name buried under a pile of closed cases. Later that night, Malcolm sat in his car, parked in his usual spot. The street was quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. He glanced in the rearview mirror. No flashing lights, no cruiser. For now, the coffee shop smelled of roasted beans and freshly baked pastries. The kind of place where people met for quiet conversations or caught up on work. Malcolm sat at his usual table near the window, his laptop open, though his focus kept drifting. The feeling of being watched hadn't left him, and no amount of caffeine could shake it. A young woman at the counter caught his attention, not because he recognized her, but because of how she glanced over her shoulder, shifting her weight uncomfortably as she ordered. Something about her posture set off an alarm in Malcolm's mind. Then, the door swung open, and the atmosphere changed instantly. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, scanning the cafe with purpose. One of them spotted Malcolm and nodded toward his partner. The second officer approached the counter, whispering something to the young woman. She hesitated before nodding stiffly. Malcolm was already pushing back his chair when the first officer reached him. "Sir, we need you to come with us." He met the officer's gaze evenly. "On what charge?" The second officer turned to the nervous woman at the counter. "She's filed a report, claims you've been harassing her." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cafe. Malcolm clenched his jaw, his pulse steady but sharp. This wasn't a mistake, it was calculated. Before he could respond, another figure entered. Lawson. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a smirk that barely concealed his satisfaction. "Would you look at that?" Lawson said, shaking his head in mock disappointment. An FBI agent caught making trouble in public. "That's a shame." Malcolm's instincts screamed at him to remain calm. Any wrong move would only feed into the narrative being constructed around him. "I've never spoken to that woman in my life," Malcolm said, his voice even. The first officer gestured toward the door. "You can explain that downtown." The cuffs clicked around his wrists before he had a chance to react. The weight of cold metal against his skin wasn't unfamiliar, but the circumstances were. As they led him outside, Lawson stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough for only Malcolm to hear. "Chances are, your people at the bureau will cut you loose before you even get booked," he said. "But that's not really the point, is it?" Malcolm remained silent. Lawson tilted his head, feigning sympathy. "The point is, now there's a record, a headline, and people tend to remember those more than they remember the truth." A crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, phones raised, recording every second. Malcolm was placed in the back of the squad car. The door slammed shut. Through the window, he could see Lawson's reflection, smug, satisfied, victorious. But a few miles away, in a small apartment across town, Lucy Morales scrolled through her phone, her hands shaking as she read the breaking news. She recognized the man in the photo being taken into custody, and she still had the video from the traffic stop. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. It was time to speak up. The cold steel of the holding cell bench pressed against Malcolm's back as he leaned against the wall. Arms crossed, jaw tight, the room smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a familiar combination he had encountered in countless precincts. The difference was, this time, he was on the wrong side of the bars. He had been through interrogations before, both conducting and enduring them, but what frustrated him most wasn't the questioning. It was the waiting. He knew how this worked. Let a man sit long enough in a cell, make him stew in the silence, in the weight of accusations. Eventually, most people cracked, even if they were innocent. But Malcolm wasn't most people. The door clanged open. A uniformed officer stepped in. No words, just a nod, a sign to follow. Minutes later, he was standing in front of a desk where his personal belongings were placed in a plastic tray. His wallet, keys, and phone sat untouched. He grabbed his phone first, barely acknowledging the officer behind the desk. "You're free to go," the officer muttered, barely looking at him. Malcolm didn't need to ask why. As he stepped out into the late afternoon light, a familiar figure was waiting near the entrance. Daniel Carter. dressed in his usual sharp suit, arms crossed, a tight smile on his face. "You owe me a drink," Carter said. Malcolm exhaled. "What did you do?" Carter pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and held it up. The video played, grainy but clear. It showed the traffic stop, Lawson's intimidation, the unnecessary search. More importantly, it showed Malcolm complying, not resisting. It showed the truth. "This went viral an hour ago," Carter said. "People are talking. News outlets picked it up. And your victim suddenly doesn't want to press charges anymore." Malcolm took a deep breath. "Lucy Morales?" Carter nodded. She was scared, but she finally came forward. "I think she realized this wasn't just about you. It was about what could happen to anyone." The two men walked toward Carter's car, keeping their voices low. "Doesn't matter that the charges are dropped," Malcolm said. "This was never about putting me away. It was about putting a mark on my record." Carter's expression darkened. "And now, it's about damage control. The department will try to bury this. Make it look like a misunderstanding. Lawson's not going anywhere. Not unless we make this bigger than him." Malcolm leaned against the car, looking out at the city beyond the precinct. He had spent his life upholding the law, believing in justice, even when it was flawed. But this wasn't just a rogue cop with a grudge. This was something larger, something embedded deep within the system. Lawson wasn't working alone. Malcolm sat in his dimly lit apartment, laptop open, fingers tapping restlessly against the table. The walls around him were lined with bookshelves filled with case files, reports, and law enforcement manuals, remnants of a career spent pursuing justice. But this wasn't about official channels anymore. A half-empty cup of coffee sat beside him, long since gone cold. He barely noticed. His focus was locked on the screen, where a series of internal reports scrolled past. Lawson had been on the force for nearly a decade, and for most of that time, his record had been spotless, too spotless. It was the kind of profile that raised alarms in Malcolm's mind. No complaints that stuck, no disciplinary actions, no paper trail. Either Lawson was the cleanest cop in Minneapolis, or someone was scrubbing his history. But Malcolm knew where to look. Deep in the archives of old case files, buried under routine reports, he found it. A name. Jamal Grayson. 3 years ago, Grayson had been a 20-year-old college student walking home late at night when he was stopped by officers responding to a suspicious person call. Minutes later, he was dead. The official report claimed he had resisted arrest, reached for an officer's weapon. The case had been closed without charges. But what stood out wasn't just the familiar pattern, it was the name of the responding officer. Derek Lawson. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. This wasn't just about harassment or intimidation. This was about something darker. He reached for his phone and dialed. The line clicked after a few rings. "Tell me you have something," Carter said on the other end. "I do," Malcolm replied, "but it's worse than we thought." Carter sighed. "How bad?" Malcolm hesitated for half a second, then said, "Lawson was involved in the Jamal Grayson case." The silence on the other end was heavy. Then Carter spoke, his voice low. "I remember that case. The family never got answers. They tried to fight it, but the department shut it down fast. No body cam footage, no independent witnesses." Malcolm nodded, though Carter couldn't see him. "That's because there was one witness. And I need to find them." Carter exhaled. "I'll see what I can pull. But if this is what it looks like, you're stepping into something big. Be careful." Malcolm hung up, his mind already racing ahead. He had a name, a thread to pull. He just needed to find the right person willing to talk. Hours later, after combing through old court documents and witness statements, he found what he was looking for. Tyrone Hayes. He had been a security guard working at a nearby gas station the night Grayson was killed. His statement had been brief, almost too brief. He had heard shouting, seen flashing lights, but did not witness the event directly. It was vague, too vague. Malcolm checked the address listed in the report and drove across town to a small apartment complex. He knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again. Nothing. A neighbor poked her head out from the next unit. "You looking for Tyrone?" Malcolm turned. "Yeah. Is he home?" The woman shook her head, her face tightening. "Hasn't been around in weeks. Moved out real sudden. Didn't say where he was going. Malcolm felt the weight of her words settle in his stomach. Tyrone Hayes hadn't just left. He had disappeared. Malcolm stood outside Carter's office, staring at the frosted glass door that now had a simple white sheet of paper taped to it. The words were blunt. Office closed until further notice. He pushed open the door, expecting to find Carter sitting behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, working the phone like he always did. Instead, the office was empty. The usual stacks of case files were gone. The bookshelves, normally cluttered with legal texts and reference materials, looked strangely bare. A voice startled him. "If you're looking for Daniel Carter, he's not seeing clients anymore." Malcolm turned to see a woman in a business suit standing near the doorway. Her expression was neutral, but there was something measured in her tone. "What happened?" he asked. She glanced at the empty desk. The Minnesota Bar Association received an ethics complaint against him. He's been suspended pending an investigation. Malcolm clenched his jaw. "That's not possible. He's one of the best attorneys in the state." She hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Then she lowered her voice. The complaint wasn't just about his legal practice. Someone accused him of witness tampering. There was enough pressure behind it that they fast-tracked the suspension. The weight of the words settled in Malcolm's chest. This wasn't about ethics. It was about shutting Carter down. Without another word, he turned and left. As he walked to his car, his phone vibrated. It was an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. A voice crackled through the line. "Male. Controlled. You're pushing too hard. Bennett." Malcolm stopped mid-step. "Who is this?" he asked. A low chuckle. "That's not important. What is important is that you stop asking questions. You're not untouchable." Malcolm tightened his grip on the phone. "That sounds like a threat." "It's a warning," the voice replied. "You've already seen what happens when people get involved in things they shouldn't. Don't be next." The line went dead. Malcolm stared at the screen for a long moment before sliding the phone back into his pocket. The warning was clear. He was officially a target. Later that night, he sat in his apartment, scrolling through old police reports. He knew what he was looking for. And after an hour of searching, he found it. Another name. Andre Wallace. A man who had died in police custody 6 months before Jamal Grayson. The official cause of death had been ruled an accidental overdose. But the arresting officer had been Derek Lawson. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about Lawson. This was about something bigger. And someone had been making sure these cases disappeared. The glow from Malcolm's laptop illuminated the darkened apartment, casting sharp shadows against the walls. The room was silent except for the occasional click of the keyboard as he sifted through files, each document pulling him deeper into something far worse than he had imagined. For the past 2 hours, he had been searching through internal reports, disciplinary records, and obscure case notes buried in forgotten archives. What he found sent a chill down his spine. Lawson wasn't just a rogue cop acting on his own. He was protected. A confidential report, likely never meant to be seen outside the department, confirmed what Malcolm had suspected. Lawson was named in multiple complaints, all involving excessive force against black men, some of whom had ended up in the hospital, others in the morgue. Yet, every case had been dismissed. Every internal investigation had resulted in insufficient evidence. Witnesses had either recanted their statements or disappeared altogether. One name appeared more than once in these documents. Lieutenant Roger Calloway. Malcolm exhaled, sitting back in his chair. Calloway was Lawson's superior, but based on these reports, he was more than that. He was the shield that had kept Lawson, and likely others, untouchable. Malcolm pulled out his phone and dialed Carter's number. It rang twice before going to voicemail. He tried again. No answer. He frowned. Carter had been on edge since his suspension. But he wouldn't just ignore a call. Not after everything that had happened. A sharp knock on the door made Malcolm's pulse quicken. He reached for the Glock he kept in the side drawer, then approached the door cautiously. Peering through the peephole, he saw a familiar face. Lucy Morales. He opened the door, and she stepped inside quickly, eyes darting to the hallway before he closed it behind her. I didn't know where else to go," she said, voice unsteady. "What happened?" Malcolm asked. Lucy pulled out her phone and handed it to him. The screen displayed a news article. Attorney Daniel Carter killed in car crash. Malcolm stared at the words, his mind refusing to process them. An accident, Lucy whispered. That's what they're calling it. His grip tightened around the phone. No, this wasn't an accident. This was a warning. Malcolm sat across from Rachel Kim in a small, dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place where conversations were drowned out by the hum of the coffee machine and the occasional clatter of silverware against ceramic plates. Rachel, a seasoned investigative journalist, was flipping through a worn notebook, scribbling notes between glances at Malcolm. She had been covering corruption cases for years. But this one had a different weight to it. "You're sure you want to go public with this?" she asked. Looking up, Malcolm nodded. "If we don't, Carter's death is just another name on a long list of people who got in the way." Rachel sighed, closing her notebook. "All right, but once this is out there, you can't take it back." They left the diner separately. By the time Malcolm got home, the news was already spreading. Rachel had wasted no time. The headline read, "FBI agent accuses Minneapolis police officer of covering up unsolved deaths." It wasn't just about Lawson. The report detailed a pattern. Unarmed black men dying in police custody. Investigations going nowhere. Complaints disappearing. Rachel had named Calloway, too, outlining his role in shielding corrupt officers. The reaction was immediate. By the next morning, protests had begun forming outside the police department. Community leaders were demanding an independent investigation. The pressure mounted, and by midday, a spokesperson from the department issued a statement. Derek Lawson was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. Malcolm watched the press conference from his apartment, arms crossed. He knew what this was. A temporary move to quiet the noise. Lawson wasn't in handcuffs. He wasn't facing charges. He was just being sent home with pay. The system was protecting itself. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. "You should have kept your mouth shut." The voice said, calm, almost casual. Malcolm didn't respond, waiting. "You think this changes anything? We've been running this city for decades. A few headlines won't stop us." The line went dead. Malcolm exhaled slowly, staring at the phone. This wasn't over. Hours later, as he was going through old case files, an email notification popped up on his screen. No sender, no subject line, just an attachment. A single audio file. He clicked play. A muffled voice, barely above a whisper, spoke. "Lawson isn't the one pulling the strings. But I can tell you who is." Malcolm played the recording again, letting the distorted voice fill the silence of his apartment. The message was brief, but it was enough to confirm what he already suspected. Lawson wasn't the mastermind. Someone higher up was pulling the strings. Rachel Kim sat across from him, arms crossed, her expression sharp with focus. She had spent years uncovering corruption. But this was different. The weight of it, the danger, it was on a whole new level. "This voice," she said, "it's modulated, but it sounds like a man. Someone who knows exactly what's happening inside the department." Malcolm nodded. "Whoever it is, they know Lawson isn't acting alone. They want this to come out. But they're too scared to say it directly." Rachel tapped her fingers against the table. "If we're going to follow this, we need a name. Leads don't just fall from the sky." Malcolm pulled up his notes. "There's one person who might be able to tell us more." He turned the screen toward Rachel. A profile picture of a middle-aged man stared back at them. "Luis Ramirez," he said, "former cop, worked with Lawson 5 years ago. He left the force after filing an internal complaint. 2 months later, he disappeared." Rachel leaned forward. "Disappeared or was made to disappear?" Malcolm exhaled. "That's what we're about to find out." They spent hours tracking down old addresses, scouring legal records, and cross-referencing news reports. Finally, a small lead emerged. A rental property in a town 2 hours north. The lease had been signed under a fake name, but Malcolm recognized the handwriting from an old police report. They drove in silence, both lost in thought. The closer they got, the heavier the air felt. Rachel broke the silence. "If he really is hiding, do you think he'll talk?" Malcolm gripped the wheel. "If he knows what Lawson is capable of, he doesn't have a choice." The house was tucked away on a lonely stretch of road, surrounded by thick trees. They parked a block away and approached on foot. Malcolm knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Harder. A rustling sound came from inside. Then, a voice, low and cautious. Go away. Malcolm glanced at Rachel before speaking. Luis, we know who you are. We know what happened. If you don't talk to us, they're going to find you first. Silence. Then, the door cracked open just enough for a tired, wary face to appear. Luis Ramirez looked like a man who hadn't slept in years. His eyes darted between them, searching for a threat. You don't know what you're asking for, he said. Before Malcolm could answer, the quiet night shattered. Headlights appeared from the darkness, followed by the roar of engines. Multiple vehicles. The unmistakable slam of car doors. Luis's face went pale. You led them here. Malcolm spun around just as the first gunshot rang out. The gunshot shattered the night, echoing through the trees like a warning. Malcolm ducked instinctively, grabbing Luis by the arm and yanking him back into the house. Rachel was already moving, slamming the door shut as another round struck the wooden frame, splintering it inches from where she had been standing. Luis stumbled, his breath ragged. They found me, he muttered. They always find you. Malcolm didn't have time to argue. The headlights outside flared brighter, casting long shadows against the walls. He could hear boots crunching on gravel, the metallic click of weapons being readied. We need to move, Malcolm said. Luis shook his head. Back door leads to the yard. But they'll have it covered. Rachel checked her phone, swearing under her breath. No signal. They must have a jammer. Malcolm's mind raced. They couldn't just wait. He spotted a window in the back room, small but wide enough for them to squeeze through. Out the window, into the woods. We split up. Meet at the old warehouse down the road. Luis hesitated. They'll shoot us down before we make it. Malcolm grabbed his wrist. Then we don't give them the chance. Another gunshot, closer this time. The front door shook from an impact. No more time to think. Rachel went first, slipping through the window and landing in a crouch. Malcolm helped Luis through, then followed, just as the door burst open behind them. Shouts erupted. Flashlights swept the yard. Then the shooting started. They ran. The woods were thick, branches whipping against their faces as they sprinted through the underbrush. Malcolm could hear the men behind them, barking orders, closing in fast. Luis stumbled, clutching his side. A shot had grazed him. He gritted his teeth but kept moving. Up ahead, the old warehouse loomed, a skeletal structure half swallowed by darkness. Almost there, they pushed through the rusted door, slamming it shut behind them. The air inside smelled of oil and decay, the vast space empty except for a few rotting crates. Malcolm crouched beside Luis, pressing a hand to the wound. Blood seeped through his fingers. Stay with me, Malcolm said. Luis let out a weak laugh. Didn't think this was how I'd go. Rachel knelt beside them, her hands shaking as she ripped a piece of fabric from her shirt to help stop the bleeding. Luis's grip tightened on Malcolm's arm. His eyes, cloudy with pain, locked onto his. It's bigger than Lawson, he whispered. Bigger than Calloway. Malcolm leaned closer. Who? Luis swallowed hard, his voice barely above a breath. There's someone above them all, controlling everything. His head slumped back. A floodlight swept through the warehouse. Then came the voice. Malcolm Bennett, drop your weapon and put your hands in the air. He froze. That voice, familiar, authoritative. A figure stepped into view. Gun drawn. A badge glinted in the harsh light. FBI. And Malcolm knew him. An agent he had once trusted. You're under arrest, the agent said, for the murder of Luis Ramirez. The holding cell was colder than Malcolm expected. Not just in temperature, but in the way it stripped him of everything. His badge, his gun, his authority. He sat on the metal bench, his hands resting on his knees, forcing himself to stay calm. The air smelled of sweat and disinfectant. The silence broken only by the occasional buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. The door creaked open, and a man in a crisp suit stepped inside. Special Agent Jonathan Pierce. Malcolm had worked with Pierce before. He was sharp, by the book, the kind of agent who played things safe. But right now, his expression was unreadable. You've got people in your corner, Pierce said, crossing his arms. Calls are coming in. Someone out there wants you released. Malcolm met his gaze. That mean I'm free to go? Pierce didn't answer right away. He pulled out a chair, sitting down across from Malcolm, lowering his voice. Not yet, and if I were you, I wouldn't count on it happening anytime soon. Malcolm leaned forward. I assume you know what's going on. This isn't just about me. There's a whole network operating inside the department. And now it looks like it's in the bureau too. Pierce exhaled through his nose. There's nothing on record linking Lawson or Calloway to any larger conspiracy. And as far as the bureau is concerned, you're now a suspect in a murder investigation. Malcolm shook his head. That's the play. Then, take away my credibility, keep me locked up, and hope the story disappears. Pierce didn't deny it. He simply stood, adjusting his cuffs. For what it's worth, I don't think you killed Ramirez. But you've pissed off the wrong people. The door opened again, and another agent stepped inside. Time's up. Pierce hesitated, then turned back to Malcolm. Be careful who you trust. The words lingered long after he was gone. Across the city, Rachel Kim sat in front of her laptop, heart pounding as she hovered over the publish button. She had spent hours compiling everything. Luisa's testimony, Malcolm's warnings, the names tied to the cover-up. She knew what would happen once she released it. The article went live at 8:07 p.m. By 9 o'clock, news stations were picking it up. By 10:30, people were protesting outside the police department. The pressure was building. But at 11:15, Derek Lawson received a message. 3 words. Handle Bennett, now. The ride was silent except for the low hum of the engine. Malcolm sat in the back of the transport vehicle, hands cuffed, his mind turning over every possible scenario. The 2 uniformed officers in the front seat spoke in hushed tones. But he could tell something was off. They weren't headed toward the federal holding facility. The route was wrong. Too many turns. Too many empty stretches of road. Then he saw it. Up ahead, a row of vehicles blocked the narrow road, their headlights beaming through the darkness. The officers didn't hesitate. They stopped. The back doors swung open. And there he was, Lawson. He wore plain clothes, but the smirk on his face was unmistakable. Time to take a walk. Agent Bennett, he said. Malcolm didn't move. He knew how this worked. If he stepped out, he might not be stepping back in. One of the officers yanked him out by the arm. The ground was damp beneath his feet. A quick glance around told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't an arrest. It was an execution. The sky above was heavy with clouds, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. They had driven him to the outskirts of a construction site, abandoned for the night, remote, no cameras, no witnesses. Lawson took a step closer, his voice smooth, almost casual. You know, I thought about just letting you rot in that cell. But then you had to go and make things messy. Malcolm kept his breathing steady. Messy? You mean exposing a corrupt cop who's been hiding behind a badge? Lawson's smirk twitched. You think you're the first guy to try this? You think you're special? Malcolm tilted his head. No, but I think I'm the first one who knows exactly how scared you are. That got a reaction, a flicker of something in Lawson's eyes. Doubt. Malcolm pressed forward. You had Ramirez killed because he knew too much. You got Calloway to cover for you. Made sure every case tied to you disappeared. But now you're standing here, in the middle of nowhere. Because you're losing control. Lawson's jaw tightened. Shut up. Malcolm took a slow step forward. Just enough to push. You could have handled this quietly. But you're panicking. That's why you're here. That's why you're... The punch came fast. A sharp crack across Malcolm's jaw, sending him stumbling. He tasted blood. Lawson grabbed him by the collar, yanking him close. His breath was hot with anger. You don't know a damn thing. Malcolm smiled, despite the pain. But now I do. The small vibration against his wrist told him everything he needed to know. The recording was live. His smartwatch, synced to his phone, had been capturing every word since the moment Lawson had spoken. Lawson's eyes flicked to the watch. He understood. Malcolm leaned in, voice low. And so does everyone else. Panic. It was brief, but it was there. A single moment where Lawson realized he had just confessed. Then a gunshot rang out. But it wasn't Lawson who pulled the trigger. One of his own men had turned on him. Lawson staggered, a look of shock crossing his face as he clutched his side. His knees buckled, and he hit the ground hard. Malcolm turned toward the shooter. A younger officer. One of the men Lawson had brought. But now, his gun was shaking in his hands. "You lied to us," the officer muttered. "You said it was just a cleanup job." Lawson coughed, blood staining his lips. "You idiot, you don't know what you've done." Malcolm didn't wait. He lunged forward, grabbing the gun from the stunned officer's grip. In seconds, he had turned the situation. Lawson groaned, trying to push himself up, but Malcolm leveled the weapon at him. "This is over," Malcolm said. Lawson, despite the pain, still found the strength to smirk. "You really think so?" The distant wail of sirens cut through the night. Malcolm didn't take his eyes off Lawson. "We'll find out soon enough." Lawson lay on the ground, gasping, one hand pressing against the gunshot wound at his side. His men, the same ones who had stood behind him minutes ago, now exchanged wary glances. The younger officer still held his gun, but his hands trembled. No one moved to help Lawson. The shift was palpable, the moment they realized he was no longer an asset, but a liability. "You're just going to stand there?" Lawson coughed, his voice ragged. "You think this ends with me?" No one answered. Malcolm took advantage of the hesitation. He lunged, knocking the gun from the young officer's grip and swinging a hard elbow into his ribs. The man staggered, and in that moment of chaos, Malcolm grabbed the weapon and turned it on the rest of them. "Nobody moves," he said. The officers froze. They weren't ready for this to go sideways. Then, in the distance, the sound of sirens cut through the night. The men exchanged nervous glances. The whole reason they had brought Malcolm here was to handle things quietly. With law enforcement closing in, silence was no longer an option. "You better start running," Malcolm said, his voice even, "because if they find you here, you're going down with him." Lawson groaned, trying to sit up. "Don't." But it was too late. The first of the men bolted, disappearing into the darkness. One by one, they scattered. Malcolm watched as the last officer hesitated, then turned and ran. Lawson had been abandoned. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the construction equipment as multiple SUVs screeched to a stop. Doors flew open, and agents poured out. Malcolm lifted his hands, still holding the weapon. "FBI," he shouted. "I'm unarmed." Pierce was the first to step forward, his gun drawn, eyes scanning the scene. "Stand down," he ordered, motioning for the other agents to lower their weapons. He approached, gaze shifting between Malcolm and Lawson, who was barely conscious. "What the hell happened here?" Malcolm exhaled. "I think you just cracked open the biggest corruption case in the city." The next 24 hours were a blur. Lawson was taken into custody. His blood-stained shirt, the dirt on his hands, it was all caught on camera as reporters swarmed the precinct. The footage of him being escorted inside, his face pale, his jaw clenched, played on every major news outlet. Then the names started dropping. Calloway, other high-ranking officials. Documents surfaced, linking them to cover-ups. Intimidation. Illegal operations stretching back years. A network built on silence, now collapsing under the weight of its own secrets. But Malcolm knew it wasn't over. 2 days later, he sat in an interrogation room across from Lawson. The man looked different. The arrogance had faded, replaced with something colder. Malcolm leaned forward. "It's done. Your people turned their backs on you. You're alone." Lawson smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Am I?" He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You think this is a victory? You think this ends with me and Calloway?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "You haven't even touched the one pulling the strings." Malcolm felt something tighten in his chest. "Who?" he asked. Lawson just smiled. "You'll find out soon enough." The courthouse steps were packed with reporters, their cameras flashing in rapid succession as Malcolm stepped outside. The trial had ended hours ago, but the media frenzy hadn't slowed. Derek Lawson had been sentenced. It wasn't the maximum penalty Malcolm had hoped for, but it was something. Enough to put him behind bars for years. Enough to make an example of him. Yet, as Malcolm stared at the headlines scrolling across the news ticker on a nearby building, a familiar unease settled in his chest. Disgraced officer sentenced in corruption case, but is it enough? He already knew the answer. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutors had pushed for a harsh sentence. But the system, as always, found a way to soften the blow. Lawson's legal team argued that he had only been following orders, that he was a pawn in a much larger game. The judge, bound by procedural constraints, had handed down a punishment that, while significant, felt incomplete. Calloway and several senior officials had been removed from their positions, but none had faced criminal charges. The department released a statement about restructuring and renewed commitments to accountability. Standard public relations spin. It wasn't justice. It was damage control. Rachel Kim approached, microphone in hand, her expression unreadable. Agent Bennett, she called out, now that Lawson has been sentenced, do you believe justice has been served? Malcolm met her gaze. He could give the easy answer. The answer that would wrap this up neatly for the cameras. But he was done playing into narratives that weren't true. Justice is a process, not a headline, he said. We got one conviction today. But the people who enabled this system are still out there. So no, this isn't over. Rachel nodded, recording every word. Do you think the government will take further action? Malcolm exhaled. That depends on how much pressure we keep applying. Later that night, he sat alone in his apartment. The glow of the city outside his window. He scrolled through his phone, through article after article, searching for something that wasn't there. A real commitment to reform. A real shift in power. His phone buzzed. A blocked number. He hesitated before answering. Agent Bennett, a voice said, distorted, masked. Malcolm straightened. Who is this? There was a pause. Then, the voice spoke again. You're asking the wrong questions. Lawson was never the endgame. He was a loose end. Malcolm gripped the phone tighter. Then tell me, who's really behind this? A soft chuckle. I think you already know. But no one says his name unless they're ready to disappear. The line went dead. Malcolm set the phone down, staring at the darkened screen. Somewhere out there, the real power players were still standing. And now, they knew his name. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of silence that carried weight. The judge had spoken, the gavel had fallen, and it was over. Derek Lawson was sentenced to 25 years. No parole for the first 15. Malcolm watched as the former officer was led away in handcuffs. His orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the arrogance he once carried. But even now, there was something in Lawson's expression, a smirk, a glint in his eye. It wasn't fear, it was patience, like a man who knew his time wasn't truly up. Malcolm turned away. The weight in his chest wasn't relief, but something closer to unfinished business. Later that evening, he returned to his apartment. Exhausted but unable to sleep, he set his keys down, poured himself a glass of water, and finally exhaled. Then he saw it. A plain envelope, slipped under his door. His stomach tightened as he picked it up, peeling back the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One sentence. We're still watching. Malcolm sat down, the letter still in his hands. There was no signature, no hint of who had sent it. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. Across the city, in a private office with floor-to-ceiling windows, a man in a tailored suit sipped his drink as he watched the news coverage. The headline scrolled across the screen. Former Officer Lawson sentenced in corruption case. The man smiled. Then he reached for his phone and made a call. Time to start cleaning up loose ends. The next morning, Malcolm laced up his running shoes and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the park nearly empty. He started down the familiar path, his breath steady, his movements controlled. But this time, he wasn't just running. He was watching, waiting. Because now, he knew the truth. Justice wasn't a finish line. It was a war, and it had only just begun. And that's the hard truth. Corruption doesn't just disappear with one conviction. The system protects its own. And for every officer like Lawson who falls, there's someone more powerful pulling the strings. So the real question is, how deep does this go? What do you think? Was justice truly served? Or is this just another battle in a war far from over? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more stories that uncover the truth. Don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths. There's always more beneath the surface. Stay sharp, stay aware,